Well, hello. We're going to talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine right now. These are catecholamines. And if you remember, norepinephrine and epinephrine are involved in the fight or flight response. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background, some information about the names. Epinephrine, I'll probably abbreviate it as EPI. Norepinephrine, I'll abbreviate it as NE. So keep in mind, depending on where you live, epinephrine could also be called adrenaline. Norepinephrine could also be called noradrenaline. We're going to get into this in just a second, but these are both produced by the adrenal medulla. And it just so happens that the adrenal medulla produces 80% or 80% of what it produces is in the form of epinephrine, where 20% of what the adrenal medulla produces is in the form of norepinephrine. So in the blood at any given time, you would typically have more epinephrine than you would norepinephrine. Both epinephrine and norepinephrine, what do? They're going to affect your heart. They're going to affect blood sugar levels, and that's kind of a surprise to folks, and blood vessels. So typically, epinephrine is affecting the heart. Oops, sorry, there we go. Heart, where norepinephrine is affecting the blood vessels. That's typically how that works. Norepinephrine also makes your blood vessels a little narrower. Things that we're going to need to know are, what is the stimulus? What causes the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine? Where is it made? Where is it secreted from? Where's the target? Where are these hormones going? And what are they going to do when they get there? What class they have? And we're not really going to talk about disorders in this particular one. So the stimulus here, if you guys remember the sympathetic nervous system back from AMP1, the sympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic neuron was the one that secreted epinephrine/norepinephrine. And it did that in times of short-term stress. So when we're talking about short-term stress, what kind of stress are we talking about? Physical stress or emotional stress, typically. And again, this is going to trigger that fight or flight response. Now, how do we know it's triggering that fight or flight response? The amygdala, which is part of your brain, is actually the one that picks up on that fight or flight response and then sends the information to the hypothalamus. So it's the amygdala is kind of that, okay, this is going to be perceived as fight or flight. So we're going to go ahead and tell the hypothalamus, hey, we need to start triggering that epinephrine. So this is called the sympathomedullary pathway. Okay, it's part of the sympathetic nervous system. It is going to the medulla, the adrenal medulla. So it's going to start again. The amygdala is going to send the information to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to activate that sympathetic nervous system. Remember, sympathetic is your fight or flight. It will then communicate with the adrenal medulla, which will release adrenaline, noradrenaline, also known as epinephrine, norepinephrine, which will trigger that fight or flight response. So where, again, are these hormones secreted from? They're secreted from the adrenal medulla. And if you notice, the medulla is that dark brown area in the center of the adrenal gland. Remember, medulla is going to be in the middle. And again, 80% of what is secreted from here is norepinephrine. 20% is in the form of epinephrine. Now, what are the target cells? One target cell would be the liver. The second target cell will be skeletal muscles. These are the two target areas where epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to go. So what is the response? Well, the liver actually does store sugar. We said back in AMP1 when we talked about macromolecules and carbohydrates that carbohydrates are stored in the form of glycogen in liver and muscle cells for when we need them. Well, when you're in fight or flight mode, you need it. You need that glycogen, that stored sugar, to be broken down into sugar molecules and enter the bloodstream so that way all the cells have access to it. So we have to take that stored sugar and put it back into usable glucose. The liver is one place that does that. By doing that and putting that glucose back in the blood, it will increase blood sugar levels, which is what you're wanting in fight or flight mode. The process of the liver taking glycogen and converting it back to sugar is glycogenolysis. Now, this is glycogen lysis. It is literally means splitting the glycogen molecule. Now, the second thing we said was skeletal muscle. That's the second target that epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to go to. So what does it do in the skeletal muscle? Again, go back to anatomy 1. We said carbohydrates get stored in the form of glycogen in liver and muscle cells. So the liver and the muscle cells both are going to do the same thing. They're going to take that stored glycogen, put it in usable glucose form. And again, that's going to result in an increase in blood sugar. And the same process is the same. Glycogenolysis. We're taking a glycogen molecule and splitting it. That's what that means. So it doesn't matter whether we're taking glycogen and converting it to glucose in the liver, or whether we're taking the glycogen and converting it to glucose in the skeletal muscle. The name is the same. The process is going to be the same. So you need to realize that epinephrine and norepinephrine can result in increased blood sugar levels. They can spike blood sugar levels, which is epinephrine is considered a short-term stress hormone. Cortisol, a long-term stress hormone, is also going to increase blood sugar levels. That's why you tend to gain weight when you're in long-term stress and you have a lot of cortisol. Growth hormone is also going to increase blood sugar levels. These three hormones, they're trying to get energy to the cells. So to do that, you've got to increase the sugar levels in the blood so the cells can have access to that sugar so they can perform better. Glucagon is another hormone that is going to increase sugar levels. All four of these, secreted under different scenarios, will cause a rise in blood sugar levels. Some other responses that epinephrine is going to do. So go back to your sympathetic nervous system. Think about what is going on, what your organs are doing when you're in fight or flight mode. And that's what's going to happen. That's what epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to cause. So you're going to see a lot of the same things that we talked about back in chapter 15. It's going to increase heart rate. It's going to increase your pulse. It's going to increase blood pressure. All that's cardiovascular. It's going to dilate airways. You're trying to get air in so you can take that oxygen, that bulk oxygen that you're trying to get in, combine it with the glucose so you can make ATP. So again, dilating the airways, increasing oxygen, those kind of go together. Vasodilation, again, this kind of goes with dilating the airways. Vasodilation to the lungs. We're going to dilate those blood vessels going to the lungs. We're going to dilate blood vessels going to the brain, heart, skeletal muscle. Things that you need. We're going to vasoconstrict the blood vessels that lead to the digestive system, to the GI tract, to the kidneys, to the skin. Those we don't need blood flow going to, so we're going to constrict those blood vessels. Dry mouth is going to be another one. Your salivary glands, that's going to be part of digestion, so we don't need that. So that's going to cease. Dilate the pupils, make them larger, so that way you can see farther away. And again, loss of appetite. Don't really need a big appetite when you're, trying to run from the bear. So if you remember, we talked back in chapter 15 about how there were two types of adrenergic receptors. Adrenergic, remember, is epinephrine. Epinephrine, adrenaline, is going to bind to these adrenergic receptors on the other side of the synapse. So there were two types. There were beta and alpha adrenergic receptors. Now, epinephrine activates all of these adrenergic receptors. Doesn't matter whether it's alpha, doesn't matter whether it's beta. It's going to activate everything. Norepinephrine, however, is primarily just going to stimulate the alpha receptors. Now, what does this mean? Just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on, we said that some vessels dilate, some vessels constrict, depending on where they're going. So epinephrine being the molecule, it's going to bind to beta receptors or alpha receptors. It doesn't matter. It'll bind to any of them. So depending on what the target receptor is, will depend on what happens. So if that beta receptor is sitting here on some type of cell, where you have some glycogen. When epinephrine binds, that glycogen, maybe this is a liver cell, there it says it right there, the glycogen is going to break down and be released into the blood. Now, if epinephrine binds to a beta receptor on a skeletal blood vessel, what's it going to do? The vessel is going to dilate. So we're trying to get blood flow to that skeletal muscle so it can get the oxygen and the nutrients that it needs so it can function. Now, if epinephrine binds to a blood vessel going to the GI tract, those blood vessels are going to constrict. So that's going to be an alpha receptor. So when it binds on an alpha receptor, which happens to be on intestinal blood vessels, that's going to cause constriction. So these alpha and beta receptors on these various blood vessels and various cells are going to let the cell know what it's supposed to do. So they're all going to respond a little differently. Remember, epinephrine, norepinephrine, which we're going to talk about in a minute again, is a peptide hormone, which means it cannot cross the cell membrane. That's why you see it binding to these receptors on the surface of these cells. So it is an amine hormone. So it's one that's hydrophilic. It likes water. It's actually derived from the amino acid tyrosine. So you have your tyrosine amino acid, and you just modify it a little bit, and you get epinephrine and norepinephrine. So just to kind of summarize here a little bit with epinephrine. Epinephrine affects the heart, lungs, muscles, and blood vessels. It pretty much affects anything. This is that fight or flight response that we've talked about before with the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to increase heart rate, blood flow, cause you to breathe faster, increase blood sugar levels, and result in increased strength and performance. Norepinephrine is going to include a low blood pressure situation, but you don't have to know that for test purposes. We're just going to still consider it short-term stress. Now, norepinephrine, unlike epinephrine, promotes vasoconstriction. Okay, so when you narrow those blood vessels, you're going to increase blood pressure. So again, similarly, just like the epinephrine, it's going to increase heart rate and blood sugar levels. And the only reason I put this on here was because it does have the, hey, you've got norepinephrine, which is 80%, 20% is going to be epinephrine in the blood. And then norepinephrine raises heart rate and modulates blood pressure, where epinephrine tends to be more of an antihistamine and in treating shock. I did want to throw this out there too, just because ADHD seems to be something that people talk about a lot. Norepinephrine may, they're still doing research on this, contribute to ADHD. So there could be a situation there. When you hear of drugs like Ritalin, Adderall, SNRIs, Cymbalta, these are all mimicking norepinephrine. Again, just kind of for your information here on this, certain medical conditions can trigger too much epinephrine or norepinephrine secretion, such as tumors, chronic stress, and obesity. Okay, and that is it.